Let me actually first say, economists, right? So economists take the great narratives that are created by people like Jeff, and we try to put them in numbers. We try to say, okay, now how much of this eloquent narrative matches reality if I put the numbers together? So, this piece of research has a little bit of this. So, but let's think about, if we were as economists to create states, how big would we make them? And of course, economists are always motivated by big scholars and by big minds. So this is Montesquieu, 1748, pontificating about optimal state size. And he says the following: if a republic be small, it is destroyed by a foreign force. If it is large, it is ruined by an internal imperfection. So, as an economist looking at it, you immediately see that there's a fantastic trade-off here, like on the one hand and on the other hand. Like this is the bread and butter of economists. So 250 years later, Alberto Alesina and Enrico Spolaori, they write a series of papers and a great book that they try to basically understand and conceptualize how to think about the optimal state size. And, size and scale has benefits. The larger one entity is, their projects can be financed at the lower cost, there are economies of scale to be exploited, there are larger markets, so good things come with size. But at the same time, there may be issues of, there may be drawbacks. So what are the drawbacks that one may have in mind is that, governance costs may grow exponentially as one gets to govern a larger and larger territory. And, more heterogeneity may eventually lower cohesion, disagreement about what public goods provide, and so on and so forth. So an optimal state is really about striking the right balance in terms of size, optimal state, the right balance between the beneficial impact of size and the negative impact of size that comes with heterogeneity. So there is a little bit of work in the mind of economists about how to think about states and diversity within states. Now, the role of the borders, because we have been thinking of borders mostly as an outcome, there has not been much work on actually thinking about, how the borders themselves may be consequential for economic and political outcomes. There's a nice piece of work by Alesina, Matuszewski, and Easterly in 2011, where they try to get at this issue by constructing measures of border artificiality, that is how arbitrary are borders across the world. And they, come up with, kind of very interesting measures. One is to think about whether borders split groups in adjacent countries, or how straight line like are the land borders. And so they find that, having, more straight line like borders, or borders that split more groups are actually, you see countries, such countries actually underperform economically. Now, what is the problem with thinking about borders as a driver of things? Is that actually borders are an outcome, and are an outcome usually of a very long process of what Jeff was describing, of the ebb and flow of states, ebb and flow of empires. So the process of state and border formation is intertwined with wars, the rise and fall of states, and the borders appearing, negotiated, disappearing. And this is like a series of contestations on the ground and population reshuffling. So asking whether borders are optimal or have consequences is empirically a very hard question, because they are an outcome most of the time, unless they come at the beginning. Was the partitioning of groups across different countries in Africa a deleterious event for the groups themselves? So that's actually what this is the paper about. Now, we're going to find out that roughly 40% of the African population comes from ethnic groups that have been systematically partitioned by the colonial boundaries. And we're going to actually find out that there is a strong relationship between, the event of being partitioned and the civil conflict eruption in these areas. We're going to also look at their political relevance of these groups and what happens to the livelihood of people identifying with partitioned ethnicities. And we'll always get back and ask, why is this going on? Why do you observe more conflict in split homelands? Why do you get actually much more government intervention, rebels taking the guns, and more acrimonious relationships? We're going to look at political discrimination and the instance of foreign interventions through the data that we put together. Okay, so here's basically a story of maps, right? So you see the underlying ethnic composition, the mosaic of groups at the beginning of the 20th century in Africa, and the red lines are the colonial boundaries set up by Europeans. So there are many scholars that have written on the Scramble for Africa. Jeff is one of those. Here, just mentioning two that are not with us today. Dr. Asivadzu, we learned a lot from his work, and Thomas Hackenham has a very nice book on the event. So, there is this notion that, and as Jeff said, like all borders are arbitrary. All borders are man-made, that's for sure. But now let's listen to the British Prime Minister of the time, this early 20th century, that he basically says what they have in mind. He says, look, we have been engaged, as the colonizers have been engaged in drawing lines upon maps where no white man's feet have ever trod. We have been giving away mountains and lakes, rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we did not really know exactly where the mountains and rivers and lakes were. And Asivadzu conforms, with this, with the idea that the study of the European archives supports the accidental rather than the conspiratorial theory of the marking of boundaries. Okay, so the blue groups are the groups that whose homeland, at least 10% of their homeland, can be found in different countries. So these are our definition of partition groups. Now, immediately when you look at this, you may be asking yourself, okay, now you have the white groups and the blue groups, but then, I'm going to make a story that these blue groups over time in the post-colonial era have suffered in various ways, and conflict is much more common. But then you may ask yourselves, but maybe blue groups to start with, they have been different than white groups. Even during, in terms of geography, in terms of pre-colonial characteristics. So, it's not really the effect of border creation itself is actually pre-existing features that, were different between the blue and the white groups, partition groups and non-partition groups, and subsequent, propensity to engage in conflict. So in the timeline, if I were to take a step back and say, the Scramble for Africa and its repercussions, where does it fit in the timeline of the long run of the historical determinants of African development? Pre-colonial issues, slavery, 1884 and 1885, and the next 20 years of basically intense negotiation between Europeans giving each other pieces of land that they did not own, the boundary creation, and then the colonization will take place in earnest for about 40, 50 years. This will move into next week's material. So the Scramble for Africa is a very short period. This 10, 20 years that will be very consequential in terms of the groups that were affected. Okay, now, why you would think that actually partitioning a group across different countries might lead to a higher incidence of war? Well, economically speaking, you have to think like an economist here, right? First of all, unlike split groups, people belonging to partition ethnicities have the advantage of getting assistance from their peers on the other side of the border, and may also find a safe haven when in need to retreat and regroup. So kind of like a lower opportunity cost of getting into violence, because you can actually have an exit, a safe exit, if things turn wrong, or we can get assistance on the other side. One more reason is that neighboring governments may exploit the presence of co-ethnics across the border to intervene and stage interventions. Actually, we're going to show direct evidence on that, that this is actually a very salient feature of conflict incidents in these regions. Now, groups in Africa are often excluded and marginalized from the central government, but unlike other marginalized groups, those that are partitioned may react to their marginalization by participating in coups and rebellions against the government, exactly because of their lower opportunity cost in airing their grievances. Irredentist demands can also be much stronger in these groups. That's the case for the Somalis and the three civil wars that have been fought in this homeland. Partition ethnicities may fight or may ask to secede or obtain more autonomy. The Diolas in Casamance region in southern Senegal is a clear example. And one thing that is very clear about African borders is that there is very poor demarcation, and that applies to almost all borders in Africa. But this issue of poor demarcation becomes even more problematic when this border actually crosses, straddles territory of people that are of similar, that have similar characteristics. So we're going to use the conflict data from ACLED between 1997 and 2013. It's going to give us basically incidents, locations, and events. They're going to be battles, violence against civilians, riots and protests, and non-violent activities by conflict actors. We're talking about roughly 60,000 events over this period. So this is the map. Its dot tells you, basically comes with a description. Here is a battle that took place in March 22nd, 1998, and it explains what who participated and whether there were fatalities. So the question that we will ask is that, are these more conflict? Is there more violence in these partition groups versus other non-split groups? Okay, so what type of actors we have there? We have government forces, rebel forces, militias, riots and protests, civilians, and outside and external forces. And we're going to actually focus on basically neighboring countries intervening in a given location. So, keep in mind these blue dots here. These blue dots are giving you the location of neighboring countries staging some intervention on the other side of the border. And, the other colors reflect the other actors. So what we will do, we will aggregate, we will basically count all type of violent events within a given ethnic homeland. And then we're going to ask the question, do you observe more fatal violent events or violent events more generally in the areas of partitioned ethnic groups? So I'm not going to bore you with the details. I just want to basically show you some summary statistics. That's kind of a simple paper because, once you establish, first of all, that you cannot find a smoking gun about what predicts the partitioning of a group, then you can use it as a quasi-historical natural experiment to look at the consequences of it in whatever you want to look at. So in this case, we're looking at conflict. So here is like what is a kind of a benchmark result is that partitioned ethnic groups, they're 30, on average, they will have 30 battles in a given in their location compared to non-partitioned groups that would have on average just 20 events. If you were to focus only on groups that are right at the border, and there you would have split and non-split groups, the split groups would they have actually 30 events of violent events compared to just 15 of the neighboring non-partition groups. And this is a very stable pattern across different specifications. So what we learn, conflict incidence is much higher in partition groups. There's the intensity of conflict events is roughly 60 to 70% higher, and casualties are actually much more common. Now you may ask yourself now, but why is this going on? Why there is more conflict actually? So what we see in the data is that there are many more interventions for neighboring countries, from nearby countries. So actually, let me take you there. So this is now, I'm asking the question, focus only on events that one of the perpetrators is a neighboring country. Where you will see these interventions taking place, this is kind of the places where actually partition groups reside. So, that's an event here, basically, that gives you an idea of, in 2007. Sudan occupies territory of the Alur are split between DRC and Sudan for administrative reasons. So you see here, like this notion of like using the presence of co-ethnics on the other side of the border to use them to basically stage an intervention. It may echo a lot of what is going on these days in other parts of the world.